welcome into this week's book club episode for Star Wars Catalyst. If you're not familiar with the series, we're going through this book a couple of chapters at a time to dig into the themes and happenings and everything that's going on, and really dig deep. If you want, you can check the description of this video and it will take you back to the beginning of this series, as well as have show you the other books that we have done as a part of this book club. But today we're discussing Catalyst chapters 18, 19, and 20. We have quite a bit to talk about today, so I'm going to try to get us through this without too much dawdling. We're starting out with chapter 18, combinatory plan, which I probably mispronounced because I can't say most things in English. But here we have Haas. Haas Obit is on Ryloth, so he thinks he's going to get word of his next job. He thinks it's a little strange because it's not in his usual cantina place, and he's witnessing a parade about the battle for Ryloth. So this is another Clone Wars reference, is another reference to the Ryloth episodes that we got from Star Wars The Clone Wars. He's talking about how it's kind of the revisionist history of it all, how it doesn't really talk about the freedom fighter Cham Syndulla, how it doesn't really talk about a free, independent Ryloth, that it's really about how the Republic and therefore the Empire came in and defeated the Separatists. So again, we're seeing how the Empire is kind of rewriting these things. That's important for a couple of reasons. One, just in of itself, rewriting this particular piece of history, but it also ties into just the age-old question of how could everybody have forgotten about the Jedi in such a short span of time? And of course, the Empire is working hard to paint things that happened in the past as happening a certain way. And this is something this book does really well. Catalyst does exceptionally well. It gives you all of these references to this sort of thing, but they're always happening in the background, right? So like a couple of weeks ago, we had Haas meeting with Matisse for the first time in that cantina, but it's set in the Empire coming in and not even liking bar fights. The way that Lyra noticed that you can't go to the Jedi Temple grounds back when it was still like set during the Clone Wars, so several weeks ago. This book does a really good job of giving you the greater galactic context as the setting in whatever the particular part of the story is. And that's something that I don't know that I necessarily picked up on up until this point, but something that kind of occurred to me as I was reading this chapter is how much it's giving you that bigger exposition and state of the galaxy, rather than making that the plot itself, making that the setting that the plot interacts in. And that becomes more aware too as we see what, like in the last couple of weeks, what Haas has been doing on these legacy worlds and what's been happening to them. And that's going to come into play in our readings for today. But while he's there, Haas gets some really bad news and finds out that Matisse is dead. He's gone. With this news, Haas has learned that basically his operation is suspended, that he's not going to be able to do any more of these runs anymore, which is a problem for him because he just put down like a down payment on a freighter, so he's kind of gone from good luck to bad luck again, which is often where he finds himself, and he's about to find himself in potentially worse luck because now he's got a call from Coruscant and his good buddy Orson Krennic is on the line. And at this point he's pretty much sure that like he's always been working for Orson. He's going to have to go back and see what Krennic wants. The end of the chapter is a protest, and Haas gets the idea that this protest that has kind of turned violent is going to be the final excuse the Empire needs to fully take over Ryloth, and so we see yet another planet fall to what is the conquest of the galaxy and the pursuit of peace, as this part of the book is called. The next part of the chapter is Krennic at the Ursos for dinner. I kind of wonder if this particular dinner is the flashback that we see in Rogue One. There's a part where Jen kind of remembers her father at a younger age, and we see like Krennic is over and hanging out with them. It might not be this particular time of dinner, but it might have actually been earlier, because I feel like people were happy in that flashback. But it's the type of setting that I would imagine from that. Krennic has to figure out what to do about Lyra, because at the end of the day, he can't really get to Galen as long as Lyra and Jen are around. So Orson has a plan. He's talking to them, and Galen is saying how happy he is, how grateful he is for all of the stuff that's been provided to him by the Empire, but he's tries talking to Lyra. Now, of course, he's doing this under the guise of, I really care about you. Let me ask about you and how you're doing. But really, he knows how she's doing and he wants to get rid of her. He has had her under surveillance all of this time. He knows that he has talked to Galen's mentor, who called to let her know, like, where she was when that whole thing went down. He's aware of everything Lyra's been up to. So this is his way of kind of getting rid of her, which is to offer her this survey job where she can go do the work she did before she was married and had a child, before she kind of settled down to help Galen, as kind of this way of like, hey, let me do this thing, let me let you do this thing. Has to do with Kybers, has to do with, you know, if they can get this planet legacy status, you know, so there's environmental conservation involved, and it seems perfect for her. And Lyra can kind of tell, she's smart, that that Krennic is trying to get her to go away. But Galen is really excited about it, and it's part guilt on Galen's part that he's keeping Lyra from what she really wants to do, and it's part he wants the freedom of not having to worry about her. And I don't think that's in a he doesn't love her sort of way at all. I think that's in a he also feels guilty that he can't be a certain way for her right now, but also just the stress of knowing that there's the tension between the two of them, and that tension could go away if she could go do a thing that she does love doing. It seems like a win-win in his eyes. I liked her line of, anything else you want to say about my life, because she's feeling really pushed back from Krennic and from Galen. And I thought this was a really intelligent writing moment for her and her character. Not for Lyra, but like, I think this was an intelligent insight that Lucino had to how Lyra would be feeling. Because Lyra is very much her own woman, and as much as she would miss this work, and she does, we see, enjoy this work, she is a woman who makes her own decisions and is happy with her own decisions and doesn't need someone to give her permission how to feel. So to have these two men tell her, like, you shouldn't give up on your life and you should go and do this thing, you know, she's very like, I made this choice, and I could make this choice if I wanted to make a different choice, but I made the choice. You know, Lyra feels very attacked because she was given everything she supposedly wants, where Galen feels very indebted because he's been given everything he wants. So that's a very insightful way to portray her character that I really liked. Then Lyra and Jen do end up going. Lyra wonders if she's being sent away by Galen so he can focus, which is probably partly true. But her apprehension lowers as they get into the fresh air, and she sees her friend, and they're getting on the ship to actually go to the world that they're going to survey. And the friend is kind of like this juxtaposition for Lyra. You know, she's who Lyra could have been if she'd picked career instead of family. I appreciated, too, that the friend is actually really good with kids. She's really good with Jin. A lot of times, female characters who don't want a family and don't want kids, don't want a family, don't want kids because they hate kids and they're bad with kids. And it's a very common thing. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. And it's certainly a reason one to not have a family. But I liked that she's actually like a very personable person and actually does like kids. She just doesn't want one of her own. And so I thought that was a little bit of a refreshing characterization as well. Things get tense when Lyra recognizes that their pilot is Haas Obit. So now we see what Haas wanted, or what Krennic wanted with Haas on Coruscant. Lyra calls him out to see if he's a spy, and he claims he's just a pilot. So Lyra is really worried that Krennic's up to something here, which of course he is. But Haas is not necessarily a bad actor within that. So then we hit chapter 19, which is called Closed Interval. Krennic has been expecting Galen to want to come talk to him after Lyra has gone. He sets up a fake office in a building that is doing things, but isn't really where Krennic works, to hide what he's really up to. While they're there, it lists a lot of different shell projects, like, you know, under the Corporation of Celestial Power. And it's the, like, Pax Aurora is a line in Rogue One when Jyn is in the archive place on Scarif and she's going through all of the things to look for Project Stardust. So this is just kind of a cool way to connect to the movie, is like, you see that all those projects she's going through within the greater Death Star plans are all a part of this, and how this is how they hide the construction of the Death Star, is that they put, you know, the shielding project over here and the weapon project over there and the hyperspace project over here, and, you know, it's separating out the pieces, which is partly because they don't know how to put it together in a whole piece or a whole Death Star yet, but it's also just a really clever way to keep it hidden. Krennic is flattering Galen, and talks about how, he and Lyra are like competing for Galen's happiness and wanting to help Galen be happy, and how Krennic wants to give Galen all of his hopes and dreams, and Lyra wants him to have this suitable family. He's very clever here because he's talking up Lyra as a good person, saying she wants what's best for you, but by saying what he is saying she thinks is best might not be what Galen wants. Even though what Lyra wants is, being skewed by what Krennic has to say. Krennic really has a very good, smooth tongue, not just with Galen, but you can see it effectively here. Galen talks about Kybers and the Jedi, and it's really interesting his perspective, how I've mentioned this before, how he thinks the Jedi kind of hid their secrets and had these secrets of the Kybers. And that kind of added layer to this for me is it's easy for us as fans, and we've discussed this on Streamcast on this channel, of, did the Jedi lose their way? It's so easy for us to have seen the big picture of Star Wars, and we know things about the Force that the galactic citizens might not know, to say, oh, the Jedi weren't doing what they're supposed to. But Galen, and Krennic, the way they're talking is that the Jedi should have been more forceful in fighting in the war, and should have had attacked more and been more on the offensive, and maybe the war could have been won sooner, and how they were not using Kybers to their full potential, and how they're kind of at fault for a lot of what happened. It was such a different perspective from what I'm used to in hearing talk like the Jedi talked about, and I kind of wonder what the average citizen thought, because we know Lyra felt like the Jedi might have been losing their way. You have other characters, including, granted, Krennic is a bad guy, but Galen is not, and Galen is wondering too, like, should they have gone further? And so I thought that was an interesting, different perspective of how, like, Jedi behavior was. And I really would like to see more of just what did the average person think a Jedi was for and what they were supposed to do. And could that social pressure tie into part of what the Jedi struggle was during the Clone Wars? Because basically the massive public outcry against them following their own ways really could have had a strong effect on arcs from the Clone Wars, like the Ahsoka on trial arc, and why the Jedi would feel pressure to, like, excommunicate Ahsoka so that she could go on trial. Not to excuse that necessarily, but it adds this extra social context for what's going on. During this conversation, Galen is worried that his research might come to nothing if it's not properly replicated. So, Galen is now aware that his notes are for other people, and Krennic decides that he needs to show him something. We go back to Lyra and Jin and company at the camp. Jin has been quickly adopted by everybody at the camp, but Haas has also bonded with Jin, which I think is really cute, that she's kind of getting into mischief, and he's like, I have an eye on her. She's like, he has an eye on me. They're fast friends. I really like that. Lyra and her friend get into a conversation with Haas about the Force, and I think Haas kind of has a hard time understanding what they're talking about, or at least not wanting to understand what they're talking about, because he has so much guilt about what he's done, to talk about connecting to everything because of the Force. And Lyra admits that she doesn't necessarily want to be on Coruscant. She wants to keep doing this kind of work, but she knows that Galen's work is important, and she feels like it's galactically important, and that's kind of her struggle. Krennic takes Galen to Malpaz, which is the planet where the kind of like rival scientist that like was drunkenly fighting Galen was at, and who has been mysteriously disappeared after the lab accident. And Krennic feeds Galen this line about how it's anarchists, that now they're not fighting, separatists, they're not really even fighting rebels, they're fighting anarchists who just want to burn the whole galaxy down. And Galen is at a state, he hasn't been sleeping, he's been obsessed, his mind has been warped, and he believes everything Krennic says, so it puts this fear into him that for the sake of protecting Lyra and Jin, he has to betray his principles of being a pacifist, to actually maybe even weaponize some of what he's doing to stop anarchy, that maybe not a war between two governments was enough to stir him, but the idea of civilization versus non-civilization in his state was enough to move him. And he's aware that this is going to mean something, like that the Emperor wants to make an example out of one world to stop this from happening. Finally, Galen agrees to help with this, but says that no one can know. Then we get to chapter 20, called Deep Truth. Time is up for Lyra, and they didn't find any Kybers on this world. There's kind of an irony here where Lyra is really sad that they didn't find Kybers, because she thought for sure that if they found Kybers, that it would give the planet legacy status, and that it would protect that world. Oddly enough, this world is probably more protected because it doesn't have Kybers, which is not something she could possibly know. But once they actually start building the weapon for the Death Star, and they start building it out of Kyber, they're going to need to get Kyber from somewhere, and if this planet doesn't have Kyber, it's probably going to be safer. So there was this tension for me of, I get why she feels sad, but I'm also secretly relieved that they didn't find any Kybers here. But she worries that it's not going to make it as a legacy world now. Lyra is still struggling between not really wanting to leave, but believing fully in Galen's work, and that's when Haas does the old, I have something to show you. So we had Krennic taking Galen somewhere so he can see aftermath that Krennic falsifies, and Haas now takes them to the legacy worlds that he caused to fall, and shows them being mined and literally bombarded by star destroyers to like break up continents so that more stuff can be mined. And Lyra is kind of getting the truth of what's really happening. We go back to Galen, who's considering how to coax energy out of the crystals. Even though containment's kind of the real problem, he wants to know, what he's doing. And he's considering the crystals and how they're living crystals, and how he thinks it's ironic that the crystals seem to be alive, and yet the Jedi encased them in metal. Which is an interesting thing to think about from a symbolic point of view. I mean, the Jedi put so much thought into the hilts that I can understand it as like a spiritual relationship with the Kybers, but I think there's also something you said about putting, like, encasing the living crystals in metal. But Galen is now obsessed with this in a world for Jen and Lyra, that he can have some kind of goal for them, and it's going to kind of put him and Lyra at cross purposes now. Lyra comes home, Galen is still distant. There's some really poignant exchanges here, I think, just about their marriage and the idea of spouses who have been separated and have to kind of come back together. And it's this very real setting for this very big galactic concept. Like, they're really talking about war and weaponizing energy and principles, but it's also their marriage. And kind of having this big scale thing, but also the small scale thing for their life, I thought was, it adds that tension for why this becomes such a big conflict for them. Lyra even says at one point that he sounds like a convert, that he is just kind of believing all this stuff that Krennic has told him, which of course is true. But he tells her that, he just seemed off because he can't tell her things because of secrecy oaths. But there's definitely a wedge between the two of them now. So that's chapters 18, 19, and 20. We're getting to the emotional heart and the emotional conflict of things going forward as we go to finish up the book. That's really what I have to say this week. I'd love to know what your guys' thoughts are on the book, any insights you had on the chapters we're going through. For next week, we're going to read chapters 21 and 22, which are going to finish off part 2. So chapters 21, 22, and then that will take us to part 3 of the book. And we'll be trucking right along here to finish up. With that, if you're not already, please follow us on all the socials so I can talk to you guys some more. And I will talk to you guys next week.